Welcome to Modern History of Europe. Lecture 5, the onset of the First World War. Part 3, the crisis of July. In an already very tense situation came the news that Franz Ferdinand, as I said before, a symbol of Habsburg militarism, but a moderating influence during the 1913 crisis, was planning to make a visit to the Bosnian capital Sarajevo on the 28th of June. That date was chosen to celebrate the anniversary of his wedding to the Bohemian Countess Sophie Chotek. Yet for the Serbs the very date was a provocation, as it was the date of the commemoration of the defeat of the army of the Serbian kingdom by the Ottomans in 1389. A battle that had subjected all South Slavonic peoples to 5, and some of them to nearly 600 years of foreign domination, Austrian as much as Turkish. And Franz Ferdinand would then attend this year's grand manoeuvres that were to be held literally opposite of and in full view of Belgrade. With all such apparent provocations, and because as one of them, the 19-year-old, mostly unemployed peasant son Gavrilo Princip said later on in his trial, they considered Franz Ferdinand an evil man, a group of Bosnian Serb boys, the youngest of them only 16, the oldest 22, decided they should try to assassinate Franz Ferdinand, for they considered him an evil man, since, as said, the Archduke supported the idea of making the South Slavs to a third pillar of the monarchy and eliminating Serbia. The conspirators had had some contact with an operative of the Black Hand, Wojciech Tankosic, who had handed bombs and a few revolvers to Princip to serve for the planned assassination attempt. Princip had easily managed to sneak those across the rather typical for Habsburgs combination of red tape and sleaze, completely unguarded border between Austria, Hungary and Serbia. All Princip had to do was wade through the water of the stream between the two in broad daylight, and he had then smuggled the weapons in a peasant cart to Sarajevo, easily avoiding any controls. For mortal enemies as the two countries might be, the idea of a wall or even of a well-guarded barbed wire along the Austro-Serbian border would never have occurred to anyone in the double monarchy. And this speaks volumes for 1914's world as well. In a literature on the causes of the outbreak of World War I, that meanwhile is probably only rivaled in size by that on the resurrection or not of Jesus Christ, it has been endlessly discussed whether the Serbian government knew of the plot that was being hatched against Franz Ferdinand. It seems it had merely some fake indications that Dmitrievich and his group were arming and training freedom fighters in their optic, and that was of course a very good thing to do, or terrorists in the Habsburgs' view, and that was of course a very bad thing to do. But it appears they knew little more than that, or perhaps rather they preferred to know as little as possible. For in such a shaky democracy as Serbia's, for such an elected politician as Serbian Prime Minister Nikola Pasic to stick his nose too much in affairs of the Secret Service was dangerous. It had proven risky already in 1910, as he had tried to curtail Dmitrievich's support of the Komitachis in Macedonia, and Dmitrievich had then pleaded with the king to have him removed. The less people knew, and the fewer people knew about the Black Hound's doings, the safer it was for everybody, while the only person who knew exactly what the Black Hound did, Dmitrievich, was executed in 1917, so that everything has remained shrouded in mystery ever since. The Serbian government was, however, certainly aware something was brewing on the occasion of Franz Ferdinand's visit, and so it decided to hint to the Austrian government that for Franz Ferdinand to go to Sarajevo might not be the wisest thing to do. As it wanted, however, to avoid a scandal, lest it appear to threaten Austria, it decided to drop the hint in as low-key a manner as possible. The Serbian ambassador to Vienna hence gave merely some fake hints to the Austrian Under-Minister of Economic Affairs, who did nothing with that information. As far as the government in Vienna knew, therefore, the visit of Franz Ferdinand to Sarajevo was perfectly safe. Therefore, it had also cut on the costs of security. During the visit of Franz Joseph there in 1910, there had been thousands of soldiers and policemen afoot to guard him, and half the town had been in preventive arrest. Now a local police force of a few hundred men was considered sufficient to guard Franz Ferdinand. As Franz Ferdinand thus was driven into Sarajevo on that fateful morning of the 28th of June, the 8 freedom fighters or terrorists were awaiting him. Or perhaps rather than either of those two, those 8 boys were simply young Bosnian Serbs whose further prospects in life were grim, as half of Bosnia's youth was unemployed and the prospects on the job market were not getting any better, as Austria was stuck in a prolonged depression. And like the others, Gavrilo Princip too, whose whole life so far had been one big disappointment, whether in trying to find work or in his bad relation with his father, had contracted fatal tuberculosis as well, and Princip was unlikely to live for more than 1 more year. Rather than living out such a dreary and meaningless existence any longer, that in Princip's case would terminate soon anyway, the 8 wanted to be remembered for posterity by one big deed for the liberation of the South Slavonic people. They were true idealistic youngsters for short. In the 30s they might perhaps have gone to fight in Spain, or indeed they would have joined Radovan Karadzic's Serbian army in Bosnia in the 90s, for whom the heroes of June 1914, whom had sacrificed their lives for the cause of Yugoslavian unity, were a shining example. However, the first 2 of them could not push through the crowd quick enough to come close to Ferdinand's car, and the second one got afraid at the very last moment. But the next conspirator, Nedeljko Kabrinović, managed to throw a bomb to Franz Ferdinand's car, a bomb that however missed and exploded behind the car, injuring 3 people. Franz Ferdinand's motorcade then drove on to the town hall, where he, understandably angry that on his friendly visit people were now throwing bombs at him, wanted to cancel the whole program. But the governor of Bosnia, General Oskar Potiorek, urged on him to continue the visit. He could vouch for Franz Ferdinand's safety. He knew his Bosnians. They would never try another attack. It was, however, decided that Franz Ferdinand, before visiting the Museum of Sarajevo, as was on the program, would first visit those wounded by the bomb attack in the hospital, for which his motorcade would have to drive along the quay rather than through the old town of Sarajevo. On leaving the town hall, Sophie stepped into Ferdinand's car with the historic words, "If there is danger, I should sit next to my husband." The drivers, however, had not been told of this change of program, and the one of Franz Ferdinand's car, in the idea that they were going to the museum, drove into the street leading there, on which Piotrek, who sat in front of Ferdinand's and Sophie's car, screamed to him, "You are going the wrong direction, reverse!" And so the driver stepped on the brakes, so as to turn and reverse direction, and the car came to a standstill. On hearing there had been a failed bomb attack, so that the whole program would now likely be cancelled, one of the other conspirators, Prinsep, had concluded it had all turned to failure. So he had despondently gone to a cafe to drink something. And then suddenly he saw Franz Ferdinand's car stopping right in front of the window. Prinsep ran out, pulled the revolver he had with him out of his pocket, and he fired 2 shots, one on Franz Ferdinand and one on Potiorek, which however hit Sophie. Sophie was immediately dead. Ferdinand screamed to Sophie the historic words, "Sophie, Sophie, stay alive for the children." Then he sighed to Piotrek, "It's nothing." He fell into a coma and he died 4 hours later. Prinsep would die of tuberculosis 2 years later in a Habsburg prison, refusing to believe to his very last day that it was him who had ignited the entire world war. And Kabrinović would die 3 years later. The other conspirators, however, survived the war. One would ultimately become curator of Belgrade's National Museum and another one a professor of history. Over the next couple of days, as condolences streamed into Vienna's Hofburg, it was very clear too that although, as the Russian ambassador in Serbia said, the assassins of Ferdinand were Lord praised all Bosnian Serbs rather than Serbs, Austria still had to do something. This had clearly been a well-organized conspiracy by a group of Serbs, an obvious provocation. Von Hotzendorf pleaded once again that now was the time for that immediate strike against Serbia he had been so long pleading for. Emperor Franz Joseph was mainly busy with the grand funeral of Franz Ferdinand, the so manyth grand burial of a family member he had to conduct, as almost none of them had died quietly in bed, and he left foreign affairs largely to his ministers in the meantime. Austria's foreign minister, the wealthy Bohemian aristocrat and playboy Count Berthold, supported the idea that some military action was now to be undertaken against Serbia to punish it for that Sarajevo outrage. However, the arguably most powerful man of the monarchy, Franz Ferdinand had previously always complained on how he had to grovel in the dust for him, Hungary's Prime Minister Count Tisza, protested against any overly hasty act, either because he was a sincere man of peace, as he constantly said, and probably sincerely meant as well, and there were sadly all too few sincere men of peace during the crisis, or because a possible military action against Serbia and then its possible annexation might add even more potentially discontented Slavs to the monarchy, and it would make the ethnic situation in Hungary even more precarious and its system of rule even more unstable than it was already. Tisza therefore opposed any immediate actions against Serbia, and he altogether rejected the idea of annexing it. Instead, he pleaded for deferring the matter to the German ally, whom he hoped would hush up angry tempers in Vienna, as had after all happened in 1908, in 1912 and again in 1913. However, Austria's special envoy to Berlin, Count Hoyos, found William II in an unexpectedly bellicose mood. If Austria was to react to the assassination of Ferdinand with a military action against Serbia, then Germany would fully support her, so he assured Hoyos. Partly this was because Ferdinand had been one of the few persons who was close to a personal friend to William II. His marginal notes to the diplomatic dispatches of the time excoriated the Serbs as murderers, regicides and bandits. He sincerely felt that the monarchic principle was in peril here, and that the spirit which had led the Serbs to assassinate their own king and queen still reigned among them, so that all monarchs, and dear cousin Nicky most of all, ought to support rather than oppose any action on Austria's part against those regicides, aimed at the suppression of all that unscrupulous agitation that had been going on for years amongst the Serbs as well, agitation that threatened the very existence of his Austrian ally. And partly too, William greeted that the Austrians, for once, in speaking about attacking Serbia, were showing some spirit, rather than their habitual lethargy, and their habitual leaning on their ally. All that was indispensable, and it should be encouraged if their monarchy was to survive at all, and the Germans had already given up on that. So that William in principle approved an action against Serbia, though everything depended on it being done quickly, he added. And William's position was subsequently backed by Bethmann Hollweg as well. Austria must judge, he wrote, what is to be done to clear up her relations with Serbia. But whatever Austria's decision may turn out to be, Austria can count with certainty upon it that Germany will stand behind her as her ally and as her friend. This passage afterwards became known as the blank check to Austria, and it was used at the Peace of Versailles subsequently to lay the entire blame for the war on Germany and impose crippling reparation payments on her. For without the blank check, it was argued at Versailles, and in fact without repeated urgings of Berlin for Austria to show some initiative throughout July, Austria might have remained inert. Yet despite all those urgings, both William and Bethmann Hollweg were confident it would all remain merely a local incident, or at most a small local conflict on the Balkans. Everybody in Berlin was convinced that should it come to the worst, Russia would surely back off, as it had always backed off before. Everybody in some position of power in Germany was so confident of that, in fact, that they all happily went off on holiday immediately after the blank check, whether to reassure the population, as the Fisher School thinks, that nothing was amiss, or rather because they all thought the whole supposed crisis was not such a big deal, as seems more likely. The Kaiser, for example, could not be reached for weeks, as he cruised on the Baltic on his pleasure yacht and then merrily went on to Norway next. For to repeat, we now know that the actions of the diplomats during the July crisis would lead to the First World War. They, however, did not. Certainly up to the 20th and perhaps up to the 30th of July, the general expectation was that some compromise was within reach any moment, and that before a summit was staged to solve the crisis, it was prudent to overplay one's hand a bit by asking too much, so as to attain the best results at that eventual settlement that everybody expected would be staged soon. An authoritative explanation of the motives of German policy was given in a private letter from the head of the Foreign Office Yakov to Ambassador Lichnowsky, who had been criticizing from his position in London the submission of German policy to Austrian interests, arguing that Austria, Germany's only ally, needed to chasten Serbia if she was to achieve political rehabilitation, as Yakov said, and the stabilization of Russian hegemony in the Balkans, which he described as inadmissible, was to be averted. Yakov expressed his confidence that the conflict could be localized. But though he did not want to wage a preventive war, it was still a better moment for a possible showdown with Russia than would be the case a few years on. Then Russia, quote, will overwhelm us with her number of soldiers. Then she will have built up her Baltic fleet. Then she has constructed her strategic railways. Meanwhile, our group will become weaker all the time. Typical for the kind of resignation amongst Germany's elites that if the worst comes to the worst, then let us be buried below the ruins of European civilization. Now it is possible the entire Sarajevo affair could indeed have been limited to a mere local affair if Austria, on receiving the German blank check, had acted quickly and decisively. And William had stressed this was the condition on which he had granted his support alone. As many leaders, and not in the least Nicholas II, were indeed outraged at this murder of a God-given monarch. The general mood of Europe in early July was, to speak with the Daily Telegraph, a firm "to hell with Serbia." If Austria would immediately have sent stiff demands on Serbia within short term of expiry, as was the jargon of the age, as the anger at the murder was still seething, Austria might have come away with it. Instead, despite urges of Berlin the government should act decisively and quickly, Austria dithered and dithered. And that, coupled to the meager attendance at Franz Ferdinand's and Sophie's funeral, for which only a few dignitaries and no crowned heads were apparently ready to interrupt their holidays, caused the rest of Europe to conclude the murder was apparently not taken all that seriously by Austria, so that everybody went off on holiday, including faithfully all the social democratic leaders, as we shall see. Now, one reason why the Austrians hesitated for 3 weeks in imposing their stiff demands on Serbia was that it simply took a lot of time for them to formulate the ultimatum to Serbia in such a way as to apparently contain reasonable demands, but the Serbian government should then still be forced to reject them. Merely some tame diplomatic settlement would not suffice this time. There had to be a war. Yet Franz Josef should afterwards still be able to claim he was not guilty, that he had never wanted that war, and that it was all Serbia's fault for first inciting the murder and then rejecting Austria's righteous demands for retaliation, and he indeed claimed so in his declaration of war afterwards, and he probably believed too that he had never wanted a war, as he said. Yet to repeat, if there is still one person responsible for the First World War, it is Franz Josef. Although admittedly, von Hotzendorf was surely right too, if he claimed that all persons at the helm of state in 1914 felt overwhelmed by events that they experienced as completely out of control, and they all had the impression of being dragged along by the events, as by a banjir or by a storm, rather than that they felt in control of them. A true statesman feels in control of events, while a mere official feels events control him. And in 1914, all Europe was ruled by officials, even, or rather especially, those who were wearing crowns. Another factor in Austria's hesitation was the visit of French President Raymond Poincaré, who was well known as a hawk in relation with Germany, to Russia. He might urge Russia to stand firm if Austria attacked her Serbian ally, and Poincaré indeed assured Russia during his visit that should it come to some crisis involving the recent event in Sarajevo, France would back Russia to the ultimate, which no doubt encouraged Russia's subsequent intransigence as well. Then, in a kind of queer medieval touch to 20th century diplomacy, Austria could not contemplate to start mobilizing for as long as the harvest in Hungary was not in. That would be in late July. And finally, last but not least, the Austrian government wanted to await the findings of the what was called cause of war factory under Friedrich von Weissner, a senior foreign office official who had been put on the investigation of the assassination, so as to provide evidence of clear links between Princip, Kabrinović and the Pasic government, and thus prove Austria's claim that Serbia was directly responsible for the murder at Sarajevo. However, Weissner, who came with his report on the 20th of July, could find no incriminating evidence, as Princip and Kabrinović both denied they had any links with the Serbian government. And typically in that period, even in such matters of the utmost state security, it then occurred, apparently to no one, to torture people so as to make them admit things or to plant false evidence. In all these respects too, much as with its utter ignorance of walls or fences, this was indeed a civilized age. All that Weissner could finally prove was that the conspirators had been in Belgrade and that there were links between them and Tankosic. The Habsburg government, in other words, was trying to fabricate a case for demanding stiff terms from Serbia, so as to be able to declare that war on Serbia that everybody expected to be a walkover, provided Russia, of course, would not step in. and it miserably failed in that. On the 23rd of July then, a few hours after the French presidency had steamed away from Russia, the Austrian ambassador presented his government's ultimatum to the Serbian government. It had 48 hours to respond to that ultimatum that the Austrians had carefully drafted so as to force them to reject it. Though the Serbian cabinet received the ultimatum in a mood of gloom and doom, and most ministers commented on it, "This means war," they initially opted for conceding to all of Austria's demands all the same. It would all be admittedly a severe humiliation for Serbia, and particularly Austria's demand that Austrian policemen should be allowed to investigate the murder within Serbian territory would be a severe humiliation. But at least it would save Serbia's existence as a country. The Yugoslavian cause could then always be pushed later on again. But the next day they were stiffened in their resolve by news from Russia into amending Austrian demands. The Serbians were inching close to the precipice. But, just as was typical throughout the crisis, they hoped the matter would be solved by some international conference on the very last moment before hostilities might break out. On receiving the text of the ultimatum, Sergei Sazonov, Russia's foreign minister, was outraged too. "This means war," he cried out as well, and furious masses assembled in front of the Austrian embassy in Petersburg to throw stones to it. Some demonstration of Russian strength in support of Serbia was now clearly called for. Even the Tsarist government could after all not entirely ignore public outrage. And Serbia was besides, as said, the only reliable ally Russia had now left in the Balkans. And were she to forsake her only ally, as she had done in 1908 already, as Lloyd George might have put it, Russia would have forsaken with that too the beneficent position it had gained by centuries of heroism and achievements. That would allow Russia to be treated, where her interests were vitally affected, as if she were of no account in the cabinet of nations. A peace at that price would be a humiliation intolerable for any great country to endure. As direct threats against Vienna were, however, too provocative, Sazonov instead decided, without consulting with the General Staff, to announce that the Russian army would begin a partial mobilization along the Austrian border and that it would start preparations for war. That would show Austria that Russia was watchful, but could not be constructed as a direct threat. He simultaneously consulted British Foreign Minister Earl Grey on them jointly calling an international conference to settle the crisis, as the two indeed did on the 24th. As Sazonov had intended this clear declaration of Petersburg that Serbia had a powerful ally that would not stand by idly as she was humiliated, this prompted the government in Belgrade in its reply, whilst it was still an extremely conciliatory letter, to reject the clause in the Austrian ultimatum about the policeman. It regretted, the Serbian cabinet wrote, that it was unable to, quote, accede to such an arrangement, as that would be a violation of the constitution and of Serbian criminal procedure, thus the sentence that caused the First World War. The government also moved from Belgrade on the Austrian border to more easily defendable inland Nice, and it declared general mobilization. The Austrian government rejected the Serbian reply and now severed diplomatic relations with Serbia. The Austrian ambassador boarded the train to Budapest that evening. However, the Austrians still hoped that Serbia would now back down. Meanwhile, proposals of the British and Russian governments to stage a summit of the British, Russian, Italian, French and German governments in London to sort the crisis out were received in Berlin. The two governments were convinced that Berlin would surely support some diplomatic solution to the crisis. And this was indeed what the Kaiser, who was just back from his cruise, would have preferred. He cheered Serbia's answer to the ultimatum as excellent and thought there was now no reason for war anymore. But von Bethmann-Hollweg had meanwhile become convinced that if the Austrians now immediately struck against Serbia, all this would remain a small local conflict on the Balkans. Such a local war was virtually the only way remaining to stop the imminent disintegration of the Austrian Empire, he thought. And it would, if Russia backed down after German threats, as he had always done so far, be considered as a victory of the Triple Alliance. A victory that would keep Italy in the Triple Alliance as well and would cause Romania to stay in it too. Primarily because of the threat of Romania forsaking the alliance, a threat he considered imminent if Austria backed down, Bethmann-Hollweg urged Vienna to declare war on Serbia immediately and rejected the proposal of a peace conference. Formally he did so on the ground that for Austria such a conference would amount to a court of arbitration, as Austria was not to participate in that conference and Germany was then to plead her cause alone against a jury of three more or less hostile countries. On the pretext that Serbian troops had shot on Austrian ones, Berchtold managed to convince Franz Joseph to sign a declaration of war on Serbia on the 28th of July. However, before the troops were completely ready to go to war with Serbia, it would be the 12th of August. And the Austrian government was still confident some solution to the crisis might be worked out in the interim. So too thought William II, who urged on Austria that the Austrians should take Belgrade and then go no further than that, on which an international conference might then be called to resolve the crisis. Evidence there was some prospect of Austrian concessions was, however, outweighed for the Russians by news of an Austrian bombardment of Belgrade and by German threats to mobilize fully if Russia did not cease her military preparations. The Austrian declaration of war on Serbia and the shelling of Belgrade then forced the Russian government to start implementing what was intended as merely a mobilization of soldiers and of railways in the 4 military districts along the Austrian border. A warning signal to Austria to immediately back down. But it was not intended as a provocation to anyone else, so that mobilization along the German border was to be avoided. But to his dismay, the Chief of Staff, General Januszkiewicz, assured Sazonov on the 28th that this was quite infeasible. The Russian plans for mobilization had not counted on mobilization against one power alone. If Russia was to mobilize, she could only mobilize against Austria and Germany together. As the Russian mobilization, as I said, took a very long time, if Russia was to only partially mobilize, this would upset all her carefully laid plans and preparations, and it would ensure in mayhem across the Polish border with Germany. If Germany was then to invade Russia, she might find herself in utter disarray and easily overwhelmed. Military prudence therefore dictated an all or nothing, total mobilization or no mobilization. But as Sazonov had been making such a big fuss about Russia's mobilization already, he had irretrievably committed Russia to his policy of strength already. Only mobilization would do now, lest backing down from that be interpreted as a sign of weakness, as had happened in 1908. He therefore did nothing to counter the pressure that the soldiers put on Nicholas II to agree to general mobilization. On the 29th of July, the soldiers had the agreements they wanted. That morning, the Tsar signed the orders thereto. But under the rules, the Minister of War, of the Navy and of the Interior were all required to countersign those orders. All signed reluctantly. Sukhomlinov knew full well how sadly prepared his army was. His colleague in the Navy Department realized his fleet was no match for Germany's. The Minister of the Interior sensed that war for Russia might be prelude to a revolution, but making the sign of the cross, he, as the others had done, signed too. The next morning, on the 29th, Nicholas II received warnings from both Bethmann Hollweg and William II that were Russia to fully mobilize, Berlin would see this as an unfriendly act and start mobilizing too. Nicholas II then still tried to avert Russian mobilization, as he said he was haunted by the thousands of victims he would be guilty of. But Sazonov assured him there was now no time for sentimental sobbing left. He ought to show some strength, and even his wife derided him for his weakness. With that argument, Nicholas II was in the afternoon of 30 July swayed to sign the final ukaz for general mobilization. As far as the Russian population knew, as the red placards announcing general mobilization appeared on the walls, the country was at war with Germany, and the French government had already repeatedly announced it would stand by its ally. Despite all that, however, given the long time it would still take Russia to mobilize, there was still a very small window for a diplomatic settlement at the very last moment. Yet with Russian mobilization, the relentless mechanism of these mobilization schemes now kicked in. On the 31st of July, Berchtold first received a telegram from von Bethmann Hollweg that he was still trying to work out some diplomatic settlement to the crisis and that he was to delay general mobilization. An hour later von Hotzendorf came to him with a telegram from his German counterpart, Graf Helmut von Moltke, ordering him to mobilize against Russia at once. As Hotzendorf brought him that telegram, Berchtold exclaimed, "That is odd. Who is in power in Berlin, Bethmann or Moltke?" But Berchtold opted for Moltke apparently was, and ordered immediate Austrian general mobilization. And indeed, with the Russian mobilization, Moltke was now in power in Berlin. For as practically the only way Germany could win a war with France and Russia was by immediately mobilizing her armies and then hit the weaker opponent France at once, before Russia was ready with her 5 million men strong steamroller, for which Germany had only 6 weeks' time, every day the Germans now wasted on delaying orders to mobilize might lose them the war. As the news of the Russian mobilization was thus received, the German military, as it were, went into overdrive. There was now no time for any further diplomatic delays or deliberations left, they insisted. Germany had to start mobilizing at once, and it could then delay a declaration of war with only a few hours. On the 31st of July, therefore, 2 telegrams went out from Berlin. One was a telegram to the French government. It demanded that the French would not mobilize and would remain uninvolved in a possible war with Russia. As a pledge for this, Germany demanded they hand the fortresses of Belfort and Verdun to them, a demand the French were very unlikely to concede to, as the Germans well realized. And the other one was an ultimatum to the Russian government. They reversed their general mobilization at once. The French Prime Minister merely replied that the behavior of his government would be guided by its best interests, a polite rejection to the ultimatum. The Russian government did not reply at all. On Saturday afternoon, August 1, the French, after rejecting the German ultimatum, ordered general mobilization. A quarter of an hour later, the Germans followed suit. There had still not been any reply from St. Petersburg to the ultimatum of the previous day. At 6 o'clock that evening, the German ambassador in Petersburg, Count Portales, called on Sazonov. Was there surely no hope of a favorable Russian reply to the German demand that the mobilization cease? He asked 4 times, and ever more insistently. There was not, answered Sazonov 4 times. In that case, said Portales, I am instructed to hand you this note. He then gave Sazonov a German declaration of war. He went to the window and he broke into tears. Afterwards, the Germans fabricated a story. Russian troops had already crossed into German territory before the declaration of war, and that was the main motivation for selling the war both to the Reichstag and to the German population. Germany had already been under attack and had no choice to defend itself than declaring war on Russia, so the population was told. On the 3rd of August, on a similar pretext that French airplanes had bombed German cities, Germany declared war on France as well. However, the German war plans did not call for an advance into France, as we shall see, but for an advance into Belgium, a country the neutrality of which was guaranteed by the Protocol of London of 1839. One signatory of this was Prussia, and hence it applied to Germany too, and another one was Great Britain. The Belgian government had on the 1st of August admittedly announced general mobilization, but it had ordered its troops to shoot on both French and German ones. And everybody in Belgium founded himself on the country's safety in its neutrality. On the 2nd of August, the German ambassador in Belgium requested urgently an interview with the Belgian Minister of Foreign Affairs. He looked pale and sickly. "Are you sick?" the Belgian minister asked him, on which he replied, "I have climbed the stairs too fast." He then read a note to him. Germany, stated that note, is in receipt of reliable information relating to the proposed advance of French armed forces along the Meuse, route Givet-Namur. They leave no doubt as to France's intention to advance against Germany through Belgian territory. To resist that French advance, And as it is for Germany a dictate of self-preservation that she anticipates the hostile attack, Germany must march through Belgium. Should Belgium agree, the Germans would evacuate all Belgian territory upon the termination of the war, and they would make restitutions for any damage done. Should Belgium resist, however, the note said, then Germany would be obliged, to her regret, to regard the kingdom as an enemy. The Belgians had to give an unequivocal answer within 12 hours. Belgium's foreign minister could merely gasp. This is impossible. The same night, the Belgian cabinet decided to reject that note, and on the following day, the 3rd, German troops began to move into Belgium. It is very unlikely that the British would have refrained from participating into the war anyway, so as to fulfill her alliance duties, and as several ministers already pleaded she should. Thus Grey, and so too the first Sea Lord Winston Churchill, who was by training a professional soldier after all, who only later on moved into journalism and then from journalism into politics. As a professional soldier, Churchill was always positively itching for a fight and even better for a war, for he enjoyed and relished war in his mature age as much as he had enjoyed and relished it in his youth as a soldier fighting the fuzzy-wuzzies of Afghanistan and of the Sudan. However, a part of the cabinet, including Churchill's near friend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer Lloyd George, were hesitant, and so were the Liberal and the Labour fraction in the Commons. While Grey did not manage to sway them, the Entente obliged Britain to declare war on Germany. Germany's invasion of Belgium made an end to all such British hesitations, however. Addressing the Commons on the 3rd of August, Grey attained a solid parliamentary majority for an ultimatum to Germany in which she was required to immediately withdraw her troops from Belgium or to face the consequence, a British declaration of war. That ultimatum was sent at 2 o'clock on the 4th of August, and as Big Ben then stroked 11 o'clock, Britain was at war with Germany. In Berlin, meanwhile, at 6 o'clock in the afternoon, Goshen, the British ambassador to Berlin, paid a final visit to Bateman Hollweg. The step that Britain was contemplating, Goshen reported Bateman as saying afterwards, was terrible to a degree. Just for the word neutrality, a word which in wartime has so often been disregarded, just for a scrap of paper, Great Britain was making war on a kindred nation who desired nothing better than to be friends with Britain. That phrase, a scrap of paper, became the sacred cause of the war later on for the British. Their country had to champion the cause of small, defenseless countries against Germany's ruthless militarism that saw solemn international covenants as mere scraps of paper. Yet it is by no means certain Bateman ever said that phrase, scrap of paper. The night before going to the Chancellor, Goshen had seen a play. It was called A Scrap of Paper. And that is perhaps typical for the entire mix of lies, of bungling and of miscalculation of the July crisis. That in perhaps the best evocation and characterization of it, Lloyd George recalled as follows, quote, "In retrospect, it all feels like recalling a nightmare. And after reading most of the literature explaining why the nations went to war and who was responsible, the impression left on my mind is one of utter chaos, of confusion, of feebleness and futility, and especially of a stubborn refusal to look at the rapidly approaching cataclysm. The nations backed their machines over the precipice. Amongst the rulers and the statesmen, who alone could give the final word that caused great armies to spring from the ground and march to and across frontiers, one can see now that not one of them wanted war, certainly not on this scale. Austrian and German rulers and statesmen had a hankering desire for a small war against a tiny neighbor, who, standing alone, could easily and speedily be overwhelmed. It would soon be over. The prestige of Austria would be restored by this exhibition of her irresistible might, and Germany would once more prove herself the undoubted master of Europe and the unchallengeable arbiter of its destiny. But the last thing any of these rulers and statesmen wanted was a prairie fire that would scorch up a whole continent. Those who directed affairs amongst the Central Powers only felt that they must burn out that wasps' nests, as they called Serbia, and they never seemed to take cognizance of the fact that the grass of the plains of Europe was all tinder. There were no arresting voices anywhere to call a halt, no dominant personality to enforce attention or to offer acceptable guidance amidst the chaos. The world was exceptionally unfortunate in the quality of its counselors in this most terrible emergency. Had there been a Bismarck in Germany, a Palmerston or a Disraeli in Britain, a Roosevelt in America or a Clemenceau in authority in Paris, the catastrophe might, and I believe would, have been averted. But there was no one of that quality visible on the bridge of any great state. Von Bethmann-Hollweg, Poincaré, Viviani, Berchtold, Sazonov and Gray were all able, experienced, conscientious and respectable mariners. But they were distinctly lacking the force, the vision and the imagination that alone could have saved the situation. They were all handy men in a well-behaved sea, but they were helpless in a typhoon. A few days before, after Berchtold had made his irrevocable decision to attack Serbia, the Bohemian writer Johannes Urzidil was walking through the streets of Prague. Coming to a tobacco shop, he noticed a group of people congregating around the telegram posted in the window. War declared, the telegram said. No one spoke. He wrote about it. Then, he wrote, I suddenly heard 3 lone words. Gott sei Dank. Thank God. The speaker was an Austrian first lieutenant. He did not try to give any reason why one should thank God for this declaration of war. What will have become of him? But all I know is that the words thank God soon changed into the much more fitting one, God help us.